On a freezing morning in Missouri, a girl pressed her hand close to a steaming pile of horse dung heaped against a barn wall. Her father crouched beside her, pushed a wooden probe into the center, and pulled it out. Moisture fogged off the warm end. "The middle is alive, girl," he said. "Rot makes heat when air reaches it." She filed the lesson away the way children file away things they do not yet need. 20 years later, standing at the mouth of a limestone cave that smelled like poison and breathing air that came out warm, she needed it. The land exchange had been filed 3 days before Thomas Keeler's body was cold in the ground. That was the part the town preferred not to discuss. A limestone wagon had rolled on its side where the quarry ledge met soft ground, and 1,200 pounds of cut stone had crushed Tomas's chest before he could clear the traces. He died on a Tuesday. By Friday, Marcellus Rook's clerk had walked the deed to the county office in New Braunfels with a probate motion already drafted. Adeline Ward Keeler was 34 years old. She had 2 children. Minnie was 9, sharp-eyed, quiet, old enough to understand what the papers meant. Caleb was 5, still thin from a summer fever that had kept him on broth for 6 weeks. They owned 42 acres of bottomland near a spring seep, good soil above the flood line, close to the proposed wagon road where freight traffic would triple the land's value within 2 years. Everyone knew this. Marcellus Rook knew it best. The debt was real. Tomas had signed a lumber note the previous spring, $41 for milled oak to finish a barn he never completed. Rook held the note. He also held relationships with the probate judge, the freight office, and the only general store that extended credit south of the Guadalupe. What Rook offered Adeline was not charity. It was architecture. He called it a trade. She could surrender the watered 42 acres and accept 80 acres of cliffland, cedar scrub, and a cave formation the locals called Devil's Breath. The 80 acres sounded larger. On paper, it looked like mercy, a widow given more land than she lost. The men at Krause's store nodded and said Rook had done right by her. None of them walked the 80 acres. None of them smelled the cave. Adeline stood on the courthouse steps in New Braunfels with the folded deed soft in her grip and rain ticking on the limestone. Minnie held Caleb's hand. A crate of winter bedding sat at their feet, 2 quilts, a woolen blanket with a hole burnt through the center, and a canvas roll that smelled of mildew. Everything they could not carry on the mule was already sold or surrendered to settle the smaller debts. The $11.60 in Adeline's coat pocket was not a beginning. It was the remainder. Deputy Orrin Vale had delivered the final papers that morning. He had not looked at her while he read them. When he finished, he folded the notice, set it on the crate, and said he was sorry about Thomas. Then he walked back inside, and the courthouse door closed with a sound like a book shutting. Caleb tugged Minnie's sleeve and asked where the stove was in a cave. Nobody answered him. The mule's name was Patch, and his left shoulder had been wrong since August. He pulled the cart up the trace road with his head cocked sideways, favoring the bad leg on every rise. Adeline walked beside him. She did not ride. The cart held the cook stove, cracked across the firebox but still drawing. 3 sacks of cornmeal, 1 sack of beans, a cast iron skillet, a hand axe, 2 tin buckets, a coil of rope, and the bedding crate. Everything Adeline Ward Keeler owned fit in a space smaller than a horse stall. The road to the cave tract climbed through cedar breaks, where the limestone pushed through the soil like bone through skin. The trees thinned as the ground rose. There was no flat ground for plowing, no grass worth cutting. The spring seep she had lost was 4 miles behind her now, downhill, on land that already belonged to Rook. She smelled Devil's Breath Cave before she saw it. The odor came down the slope in a warm current, sharp, sour, layered with something organic that caught in the throat. Caleb buried his face in Minnie's shoulder. Minnie said nothing. She had stopped asking questions 2 days ago. The cave mouth opened beneath a limestone bluff that rose 40 feet above the cedar line. The opening was wide, perhaps 18 feet across and 9 feet high, with a natural overhang that kept rain from the first several yards of floor. Beyond the entrance, the passage narrowed and turned. Darkness filled the throat of the cave like something solid. Bats had left their marks everywhere. The ceiling near the entrance was stained dark with oil from millions of wing passes. The floor outside the mouth was crusted with a pale deposit that crumbled under Adeline's boot. The air that moved out of the cave was warm, not room warm, body warm, damp and close, carrying the ammonia smell and something deeper beneath it, a vegetable rot, sweet and heavy, like a compost heap sealed under stone. Adeline set the stove down just inside the overhang. She unloaded the cart. She staked patch where a strip of grass grew between two rocks. Then she stood at the cave mouth and looked into the dark while her children sat on the bedding crate behind her. 8 weeks. That was what the old-timers said. 8 weeks until the worst cold usually came to the hill country. Some years it came earlier. Some years it barely came at all. But when it came hard, when a blue norther dropped off the plains and hit the limestone hills, the temperature could fall 40 degrees in 2 hours. Cedar burned fast and gave poor heat. There was no coal within 60 miles. A proper cabin with a shingled roof and double-chinked walls cost more than $30 in milled lumber alone, and that was before labor. Adeline had $11.60. 1 mule with a bad shoulder, a cracked stove, 3 sacks of cornmeal, 1 sack of beans, 2 quilts, and a cave that smelled like poison. She could not leave. The debt note Rook held was transferable. If she abandoned the tract, he would file against her wherever she went. She had no fare east, no family closer than a dead brother's widow in St. Louis who had not written in 3 years. Rook had already told the merchants at Krause's store not to extend credit unless Adeline signed away the remaining deed. The escape hatch was nailed shut. The only direction was forward, into the dark. Ephraim Coates arrived on the 3rd day. He came on a gray gelding with a rope halter and no saddle blanket, the way a man rides when he's not going far and does not care who sees him. Coates was 58 years old, ex-ranger, the settlement's most respected stockman. He owned 600 acres of mixed grass and cedar east of the Guadalupe, ran 80 head of cattle, and had buried 2 wives without ever leaving the county. When Coates spoke at the store, men listened. When he was silent, they waited. He had not come to help. He had come to assess. Adeline watched him ride the perimeter of the 80 acres in 30 minutes. He did not dismount for the cedar breaks. He did not test the soil. He circled the cave mouth twice, stopped, and sat on his horse, looking at the overhang the way a man looks at a wound he knows will not heal. Then he got down and walked inside. Adeline followed him. Coates moved through the front chamber with the slow attention of someone counting losses. He touched the ceiling where the limestone dripped. He kicked at the guano crust near the throat of the passage and watched it crack and puff. He held his lantern up at the narrowing point where the clean front room gave way to the deeper passage, and the flame bent sideways in the warm draft. He set the lantern down and looked at Adeline. "No plow ground," Coates said. "No proper chimney draw, no deep well. That stove is cracked through the firebox and will burn your floor before January." He pointed toward the entrance. "You have less than 1 cord of standing cedar within hauling distance. You need 6 minimum for a hill country winter, more if the norther sights." Adeline said nothing. Coates continued. "You have no roofed structure. This overhang sheds rain, but it does not hold heat. The cave draws cold air in at the floor and pushes warm air out at the ceiling, which means anything you burn goes up and out. You would need a sealed room, double-walled, with a proper flue, and you do not have the lumber, the labor, or the time. He looked at the children sitting on the bedding crate near the entrance. Caleb was picking at a scab on his knee. Minnie was watching Coates with an expression that made her look older than 9. "A hill country winter can turn in 1 hour," Coates said. "I've seen the temperature drop below 0 with ice on the Guadalupe thick enough to walk a horse across. A family in a cave with 1 cord of cedar and a cracked stove does not survive that. You would need a roofed cabin, 6 cords stacked and split, and 2 grown men's labor to have any reasonable chance. You have none of those things." Adeline met his eyes. "I have the cave." Coates shook his head. The lantern flame leaned again in the warm current from the inner passage, and the ammonia smell drifted between them. "A cave is where animals crawl off to die," Coates said. "Ma'am, I am telling you plain. This is not shelter. This is a grave with a view." Adeline looked past him at the narrowing throat, where warm air pushed steadily outward. The draft was constant, not a gust, not a random current, a steady, warm, foul exhalation from the deep interior, as if the rock itself were breathing. "Then I had better make it behave like a house before winter comes," Adeline said. Coates put his hat back on. He told her he would testify later that he had warned her. Then he rode out without looking back, and the sound of his horse faded into the cedar brakes. Adeline stood in the cave mouth. 8 weeks, $11, 1 mule. And behind the sealed wall of darkness at the back of this cave, something was making heat. The question was whether it would save her children or poison them before winter even arrived. The next morning, Adeline woke before dawn and did something no one expected. She walked past the front chamber, past the sleeping children, past the stove and the bedding crate, and into the throat of the cave with a tallow candle and a tin cup of water. The air changed within 20 feet of the narrowing point. The temperature rose. The smell sharpened, ammonia first, then the deeper organic layer, wet and heavy and alive. The candlelight caught movement on the ceiling. Bats, thousands of them, clustered in folds of limestone, shifting and clicking in the dark. The guano beneath her feet was soft in places. Not rock, not dirt, but a deep organic deposit that had been building for decades, perhaps centuries. She held the candle at shoulder height and watched the flame. It leaned toward the entrance. The warm air from the deep chamber was pushing outward, flowing past her like a slow river. She moved the candle lower. Near the floor, the flame straightened. The draw was weaker below. Warm air rose and pushed high. Cooler air settled and drifted back. Adeline set the tin cup on a ledge and placed her palm flat against the stone wall. Warm, not hot enough to flinch from, but warm the way a horse's flank is warm. Living heat, steady, radiating from somewhere deeper than her candle could reach. She held a strip of paper near the ceiling. It fluttered toward the entrance. She held it near the floor. It barely moved. 3 things. She had learned 3 things. The front chamber was breathable. The back chamber was warm but dangerous. The ammonia alone could drop a person, and the deeper gases might be worse. And the warm air pooled high, which meant it could be captured at the ceiling without opening the entire passage. Caleb's voice came from behind her. He had followed her to the narrowing point and stopped at the line where the clean stone floor gave way to the dark deposit. He said the back wall felt warm. Then he said his eyes were stinging. Adeline grabbed him by the collar and pulled him back to the front chamber. She knelt and checked his breathing. His eyes were red but clearing. She told Minnie to keep him near the entrance. Then she went back to the narrowing point alone and stood there thinking. Her father's voice came to her. Not as a ghost, not as a mystical inheritance, as a memory so specific she could feel the cold on her face and the steam rising from the ground. Reuben Ward had been a Missouri stableman before the war and an Army hospital orderly during it. He knew rot. He knew what happened when organic matter met air and warmth and time. On a freezing morning when Adeline was 7 or 8, he had taken her to the stable yard and pressed her hand near the side of a manure pile that was steaming in the dawn light. The pile was enormous, a winter's worth of horse dung and straw, turned twice, heaped against the barn wall. "Feel that," he had said. He pushed a wooden probe into the center of the pile and pulled it out. The end was warm enough that moisture fogged off it in the cold air. "The middle is alive, girl. Rot makes heat when air reaches it. Every farmer knows it. Most of them just shovel it away." Adeline had not understood then. She understood now. The back chamber of Devil's Breath Cave was not just holding residual summer heat, though the deep limestone did store warmth. The guano deposits, years of accumulated bat waste, layered with organic debris, moistened by condensation and cave water, were decomposing. Aerobic decomposition, microbial activity. The same process that made her father's manure pile steam on a January morning, but on a scale that filled a cave chamber and had been running for longer than anyone alive could remember. The bats themselves added heat during roosting season, thousands of small bodies packed in limestone folds, generating warmth that the rock absorbed and radiated. The combination was remarkable: biological heat from decomposition, body heat from the colony, and the insulating mass of limestone that kept the warmth from dissipating the way it would in open air. But the same chemistry that produced heat also produced ammonia, carbon dioxide, and other gases that could sicken or kill. The cave was not a furnace with a clean output. It was a furnace wrapped in poison. The warmth and the danger were the same thing. Adeline's idea was not to live in the warm chamber. That would kill them. Her idea was to build a wall. A sealed living room in the clean front 30 feet of the cave. The deep guano chamber left undisturbed behind a thick timber and clay partition built across the narrowing throat. 2 controllable vents cut through the partition, a high vent near the ceiling to admit warm air in short, measured bursts, and a low return slit near the floor so cooler air could cycle back without requiring the main door to open. The living chamber would be whitewashed with lime to reduce odor and seal cracks. Damp charcoal cloth would hang over the warm vent during use, not to purify the air entirely, but to reduce the sharpest fumes enough to make short exposures tolerable. The logic was simple, and it was terrifying. Control the heat without letting the poison in. Open the vent for minutes, not hours. Watch the candle flame for signs of bad air. Close the system before comfort turned deadly. It was not a stove. It was not a fireplace. It was a dangerous natural heat source that required discipline to use and could kill her children if she misjudged a single opening. But the alternative was 6 cords of firewood she did not have, a cabin she could not build, and a winter that did not care about any of it. Naomi Pape came on a Thursday with a pan of cornbread and the expression of a woman who had been arguing with herself about whether to make the visit. Naomi was 31. She had 4 children, a husband who ran stock on the next ridge, and the kind of practical intelligence that made her the first person women consulted when something went wrong. She was not cruel. She was not a gossip. She was the person in the settlement who would say the hard thing to your face instead of whispering it behind your back. She stepped inside the cave and stopped, the cornbread pan tilted in her hand. "Lord, Adeline, I know how it smells. It is not the smell. Naomi set the cornbread on the stove. Adeline, you have children sleeping in here. The smell means the air is wrong. Adeline had expected this. She had prepared for it the way she prepared for everything now, with facts, because facts were the only currency she had left. Come here, Adeline said. She walked Naomi to the narrowing point and held up the candle. The flame leaned toward the entrance. Watch the flame. The air moves out, not in. The front chamber draws clean air from the entrance and pushes the bad air back. As long as I do not open a passage into the deep chamber, the front stays breathable. And when you do open a passage, I will control it, a vent, high on the partition, opened for minutes, closed before the air turns. Naomi stared at her. You are going to heat this cave with bat filth. I am going to use the heat that is already there. The filth is the price. If the air is too foul for a lantern, Naomi said slowly, it is too foul for your children. The words landed. Adeline felt them the way she felt everything now, as weight added to a load she was already carrying. Naomi was not wrong. The air in the deep chamber could drop a grown man. If the partition failed, if a vent stuck open, if the children wandered past the line in the dark, the consequences were not hypothetical. Adeline walked to the cave wall near the narrowing point. She had already scratched 3 marks into the limestone with the back of the hand axe. She pointed to them. 1. No child beyond the white line. 2. No full door opening except in emergency. 3. If the lamp gutter's blue, close the vent. Naomi read the marks. She looked at Adeline. And if you are wrong about all of it? If I'm wrong, the cave poisons us. If I do nothing, winter freezes us. I'm choosing which death to fight. Naomi left the cornbread and took the pan. She did not say Adeline was brave. She did not say Adeline was foolish. She said, I will pray for those children. And she walked out into the cedar breaks with her shoulders rigid and the empty pan swinging at her side. Adeline listened to Naomi's footsteps fade. Then she turned back to the cave wall, picked up the hand axe, and began deepening the marks. The mockery started at Krause's store the following week. Adeline did not hear it firsthand. She heard it through Minnie, who came back from buying salt with red-rimmed eyes and a tight jaw. A boy, Naomi's oldest, in fact, had pinched his nose when Minnie walked in and announced that the Bat Lady's daughter smelled like the devil's privy. 2 men at the counter had laughed. Krause had not stopped them. Within days, the phrase traveled. Rook's Bat Privy, the Guano Mansion, Mrs. Keeler's cave parlor. Someone left a dead bat on the family supply crate outside the cave mouth, wings spread and pinned to the wood with a nail. Adeline scraped the bat off the crate with the hand axe, fed Caleb his cornmeal mush, and went back to work. The mockery was not random. It served a purpose, and the purpose had a name. Marcellus Rook had not given Adeline the cave tract out of mercy. He had given it to her because he expected her to fail, to abandon the 80 acres before filing any improvements, at which point he could reclaim it for pennies. The cave sat on limestone that might hold guano deposits worth money if properly worked. Rook had heard talk of bat fertilizer selling for $10 to $15 a ton in San Antonio, but he could not mine it if a widow with a valid deed was living in the entrance. Every joke that spread through the settlement was a nudge toward the door. Humiliation was cheaper than eviction and left no legal trace. Rook came to the cave himself on a Tuesday afternoon. He brought 2 men, one his clerk, the other a hired hand who carried a measuring tape, and said nothing. Rook stood at the cave mouth in a broadcloth coat with his thumbs in his vest pockets and looked at the planks Adeline had begun stacking against the interior wall. Building a parlor for bats, Rook said. He smiled the way a man smiles when the joke is for his own benefit. I admire your spirit, Mrs. Keeler. I truly do. But spirit does not heat a room. Is that why you came? Adeline said. She did not stop working. She was driving oak wedges into a frame she had built from salvaged fence posts. Each strike of the mallet sent a dull echo into the cave. To check the temperature of my spirit? Rook's smile held, but his eyes moved past her to the interior. The clerk was making notes. The hired hand had unspooled the measuring tape and was holding one end against the cave mouth wall. I came to offer help, Rook said. $5 cash today. You sign the quitclaim, and I will have a wagon here by morning to move your things to the boarding house in New Braunfels. $5 is generous. This land is worth less than the paper it is filed on. Adeline drove another wedge. The mallet struck hard enough that the frame shuddered. Behind her, in the dark passage, guano beetles clicked. If it is worth less than paper, she said, why did you bring a measuring tape? The smile vanished. Rook looked at his clerk, who had stopped writing. The hired hand lowered the tape. For 3 seconds, nobody spoke, and in that silence, the warm breath of the cave moved past them all, damp, foul, steady. You were given what your husband's debt was worth, Rook said. His voice had changed. The charity tone was gone. Do not pretend it was anything else. I do not pretend anything, Mr. Rook. I know exactly what the trade was worth. So do you. That is why you are standing in my cave with a measuring tape. Rook turned and walked out. His men followed. At the entrance, he stopped and looked back. Winter will settle this, he said. It always does. He rode out. Adeline watched him go. Then she turned back to the frame, picked up the mallet, and drove the next wedge home. That night, Minnie asked why Mr. Rook wanted a cave he said was worthless. Adeline told her that when a man visits something worthless twice, it usually means he has not told you what it is worth. The construction began in earnest the next morning, and it began with a problem Adeline had not foreseen. She had lumber for perhaps half the partition. The design she had sketched in the dirt, a double-walled frame across the 13-foot-wide throat of the cave with clay packing between the layers, wide, required more planks than she owned and more clay than she could haul alone. The cedar posts she had cut for the frame were green and heavy, and drilling the sockets into the limestone floor required a star drill she did not have. Adeline borrowed the star drill from Naomi's husband, who lent it without comment and did not offer to help. She spent the first 2 days drilling 4 sockets into the stone floor, 2 for the main posts that would anchor the partition frame, and 2 for the diagonal braces. The drill bit skipped and sparked on the limestone. Her palms split open before the first socket was 6 inches deep. She wrapped them in torn cotton and kept drilling. Minnie carried clay from a creek bank 200 yards below the bluff. The clay came up in coffee tins, 1 trip per tin, 6 trips per hour, 12 hours of light in an October day. Caleb twisted rags for chinking, sitting cross-legged near the cave entrance where the air was clean and the sun came in. By the end of the first week, Adeline had the 2 main posts wedged into their sockets and the lower crossbeam pegged in place. The frame looked like a doorway standing in the middle of the cave with nothing attached to it. The measuring was rough. She had no level, no square, no plumb line. She used a string weighted with a stone and hoped the posts were close enough to vertical that the planks would seat flat. The physical toll was immediate and cumulative. Adeline's shoulders ached from swinging the mallet. Her palms were wrapped in cotton that turned brown with dried blood by noon. She ate cornmeal twice a day and gave the beans to the children. She lost weight she could not afford to lose. Her dress hung loose at the waist. and the bones in her wrists stood out like fence wire. The weather was changing. October in the hill country brought cool nights that dropped into the 40s, but the days still held warmth. Mockingbirds sang in the cedars. The sky stayed high and blue. It felt like time, and the feeling was a lie. The old-timers said the Northers came in December or January, but they could come in November. They could come any time after the first week of October if the conditions ran wrong. Adeline counted days the way she counted cornmeal. Carefully, knowing the supply was finite, 6 weeks to the first likely hard freeze. The partition was perhaps a quarter built. She needed the rest of the lumber, twice the clay she had hauled, rawhide for the gaskets, sheet tin or thick leather for the vent shutters, and lime for the whitewash. The $11.60 had become $9.40 after the salt, a sack of dried corn, and 3 pounds of nails from Krause's store. Krause had charged her full price. He did not look at her when he took the money. The gap between what she had and what she needed was not closing. It was widening with every day that passed and every nail that went into the frame. And then, on the second Monday of October, she heard a cough at the cave mouth and turned to find a man she had never seen standing in the entrance with a lantern he had not lit, looking at her partition frame with an expression she could not read. He was 63 years old, lean as a fence post, with a scarred throat and a limp that made his left boot scrape on the stone. He wore a coat that had been patched so many times the original fabric was a guess. His hands were large and steady and stained with something that might have been lime. He did not introduce himself. He looked at the frame, then at the narrowing throat behind it, then at the faint, warm draft that moved his coat collar. He inhaled once through his nose and held it. "Who told you to measure cave breath with a candle?" he asked. Adeline set down the mallet. "Nobody told me. I watched the flame, and it told me." The man nodded. He stepped inside, ducked under the crossbeam, and pressed his palm flat against the stone wall the way Adeline had done on her first morning in the cave. "My name is Tobias Meckel," he said. "I used to haul guano out of caves like this one for the saltpeter works during the war. I heard a widow was measuring air in a bat cave, and I wanted to see if she was foolish or if she was thinking." "Which is it?" Adeline asked. Tobias looked at the frame. He looked at the 2 vent openings she had roughed into the upper crossbeam, one 8 by 12 inches, one 4 by 20. He looked at the tin cup sitting on the ledge where she tested condensation. He looked at the 3 marks scratched into the wall. "You're thinking," he said, "but you will kill your children if you seal this wall wrong." He sat down on the bedding crate without being asked, and he told her what she was doing right and what she was doing wrong, and the difference between the two was the difference between a winter shelter and a coffin. Tell us in the comments, Hakuki, have you ever been doubted by someone who did not understand what you were building? Adeline had no time to answer the laughter. She still had half a wall to seal. Tobias did not offer help immediately. He tested her first, the way a man tests a horse before buying it, not with suspicion, but with the careful attention of someone who has seen too many good ideas killed by bad execution. He asked what she had smelled first when she entered the deep chamber. Adeline answered without hesitation. "Ammonia high, damp rot low, clean stone near the entrance after sunrise when the draw reverses." Tobias's eyebrows rose. The scarred skin on his throat shifted as he swallowed. He nodded. "The wall needs 2 faces," he said, "not 1. 2 layers of plank with 6 inches of clay and straw packing between them. Lime wash over every crack, inside and out. The rawhide gasket around the service door must be doubled. 1 layer rots. You need the second. And your vent shutters cannot be wood. Wood swells in damp and sticks open. You need tin or thick rawhide on a hinge that will not corrode." He pointed to the high vent opening. That is your heat shutter. You open it for 10 minutes, never more. You watch the lamp flame. If it leans toward the vent instead of toward the entrance, you close it. If it turns blue at the base, you close it and you do not open it again for 2 hours. He pointed to the low return slit. That is your cold return. It stays open all the time. It lets the cooled air cycle back through the partition, so the warm air above has somewhere to go. If you block it, the warm air stops moving and the fumes build in the ceiling of your living chamber. Understand? Adeline understood. She also understood that Tobias Meckel was the first person since the land exchange who had looked at her cave and seen something other than a joke or a grave. "Why did you come?" she asked. Tobias rubbed his scarred throat. The tissue there was pale and ridged, ammonia burns from years of working in enclosed cave spaces. His lungs made a faint whistle when he breathed deeply. "Because I heard you were experimenting," he said. "And experimenting in a hot cave without knowing what you're doing is how men died in the saltpeter works. I buried 3. I do not want to bury children." He stood up. He looked at the frame, the sockets, the rough vent openings, the clay piled in coffee tins near the wall. "I will come back tomorrow," he said. "Bring every rag you own. We are going to test the draw before you seal another board." He limped out of the cave, his left boot scraping on the stone. Adeline watched him go. Behind her, the warm breath of the deep chamber pushed steadily outward through the unfinished frame, carrying its heat and its warning in the same current. She had a partner now. Not Charity. Tobias had made that clear. He had come because he recognized something in her work, and what he recognized was not courage or desperation. It was observation, the candle test, the condensation cup, the 3 rules scratched into the wall. She had been thinking, and Tobias respected thinking the way Rook respected leverage, as the only currency that mattered. But the clock had not stopped. The frame was half built. The clay was a quarter of what she needed. The lumber was running short. The mule was lame. Winter was 6 weeks away, and every day that passed without a sealed partition was a day closer to the killing cold that Coates had promised and Rook was counting on. Adeline picked up the mallet. The cave breathed behind her. The children slept near the entrance. And somewhere to the north, beyond the cedar breaks and the limestone ridges, the cold was gathering. Chunk 2 continues. Tobias came back the next morning carrying a bundle of punk cedar bark, a tin plate, and a length of wool yarn. He did not bring lumber. He did not bring tools. He brought smoke. He lit a small pile of the punk bark on the tin plate and held it at knee height inside the cave mouth. The smoke curled upward, caught the draft, and moved inward, pulled along the floor toward the throat of the cave. Tobias moved the plate higher to waist level. The smoke still traveled inward, but began to flatten, spreading horizontally. At shoulder height, the smoke reversed. It drifted toward the entrance, riding the warm outflow from the deep chamber. "There," Tobias said. He held the yarn in the smoke stream and let it trail. "Below your waist, the cave pulls air in. Above your chest, the cave pushes air out. The turnover line sits roughly here." He drew his finger across the space at the level of his ribs. "Your warm vent must sit above this line. Your cold return must sit below it. If you reverse them, you pull fumes into the living chamber instead of drawing heat off the top." Adeline had placed the vents correctly. She had done it by instinct and candle watching, not by understanding the principle. Tobias made the principle visible, and with it came a precision she could not have achieved alone. The first teaching was air reading. Tobias spent 2 days showing Adeline how cave drafts shifted with temperature, wind direction, and barometric pressure. On a still morning, the outflow was gentle and steady. On a windy day with a north breeze, The pressure at the cave mouth dropped and the outflow strengthened. Good for venting, dangerous for pulling too much warm air too fast. On a damp south day, the outflow weakened and sometimes stalled, trapping fumes near the ceiling of the front chamber. Damp south wind is your enemy, Tobias said. That is when you bank the stove, seal the vent, and live with cold until the wind shifts. A night of shivering will not kill anyone. A night of bad air will. The second teaching was sealing. Tobias examined Adeline's frame and found 3 gaps where the cedar posts met the limestone ceiling. Cave walls were not flat. The rock bulged and receded in ways that no plank could follow. Every gap was a leak, and every leak was a pathway for fumes to bypass the partition entirely. A wall is not one layer of boards, Tobias said. He had Adeline rip apart a section she had already nailed and rebuild it. 2 faces of planking with 6 inches of space between them, the space packed with clay mixed with straw and cedar bark, the straw for structure, the bark for its natural oils that resisted moisture. Every seam lime-washed inside and out, every joint between stone and wood filled with a paste of clay, ash, and tallow that Tobias mixed in a bucket and pressed into the cracks with his thumb. The work was slow. Each section of the double wall took a full day. Adeline drove the nails. Tobias mixed the packing and watched for gaps she could not see. Minnie carried clay and coffee tins, her hands raw and cracked from the creek bank. Caleb twisted rags for chinking, sitting at the entrance where Adeline could see him, and the fresh air kept his lungs clear. Tobias worked only half days. By noon, the fumes from the deep chamber, even filtered through the half-built partition, made him cough. The cough was deep and wet and ended with a sound like tearing fabric. His lungs had been damaged years ago in the saltpeter works near New Braunfels, where men hauled guano out of caves in handcarts and breathed ammonia for 10 hours at a stretch. 3 men he had worked with died of lung rot before the war ended. Tobias survived, but the scarring in his throat and chest was permanent. The cave air that was merely unpleasant for Adeline was actively dangerous for him. He never complained about it. He simply stopped at midday, sat outside the cave mouth in the sun, and drank water until his breathing steadied. Then he walked home. Some days he did not come back until the following morning. Some days he came back in the afternoon with a crate of lime or a bundle of rawhide scraps he had traded for at a farm 2 ridges over. The third teaching was heat discipline. This was the hardest lesson because it ran against every instinct. You will want to leave the vent open, Tobias said. They were standing at the partition frame, which now had the service door hung on rawhide hinges and the high heat shutter fitted with a tin flap Tobias had bent from a salvaged piece of stovepipe. When the cold comes, and it will come hard, every part of you will want to open this shutter and leave it open. The warm air will pour through and the room will feel like summer, and you will think you have beaten winter. Do not. He opened the shutter. Warm air rolled through the gap, moving along the ceiling of the front chamber like an invisible river. The temperature climbed in seconds. The smell sharpened. Count to 60, Tobias said. Then close it. Adeline counted. At 40, the candle flame on the shelf near the entrance leaned slightly toward the vent instead of toward the cave mouth. The draft pattern was changing. The warm inflow was beginning to overpower the natural outflow. Close it, Tobias said. Adeline closed the shutter. The flame straightened. That lean is your warning, Tobias said. When the flame leans toward the vent, the air has shifted. The fumes are coming in faster than the natural draw can clear them. Another 5 minutes and you will smell it. Another 10 and the children will feel it. Another 30 and you will not wake up. He looked at her with the steadiness of a man who had seen the thing he was describing. Never open the heat shutter for comfort, he said. Open it for survival. 10 minutes, 15 at most, then seal it and wait for the air to clear. The cave gives warmth, but it does not give permission to be careless. The fourth teaching was odor control. Tobias showed Adeline how to hang damp charcoal cloth over the heat shutter opening, not as a filter that would make the air safe, but as a barrier that would reduce the sharpest ammonia sting and force anyone opening the vent to pause and prepare. The cloth was a reminder, not a solution. The solution was discipline. He also taught her to set shallow trays of cedar ash near the sleeping platform, to burn small amounts of cedar bark in the stove when the vent was closed to keep the front chamber air moving, and to lime wash every surface she could reach. Walls, ceiling, the face of the partition, even the floor near the service door. Lime-sealed pores in the wood and stone reduced the absorption of fumes and gave the front chamber a clean, chalky smell that partially masked the deeper organic stink from beyond the wall. None of this made the cave safe. All of it made the cave survivable if Adeline followed the rules. The construction took 5 weeks. The outline of those weeks was labor and shortage, and the steady erosion of everything Adeline started with. The partition grew plank by plank. Tobias brought scraps of lumber from abandoned fence lines and collapsed outbuildings on his side of the ridge. Adeline hauled stone from the bluff face to build a low bench inside the front chamber, a heat sink that would absorb warmth from the vented air and radiate it slowly after the shutter closed. The bench took 3 days of lifting limestone blocks that weighed more than Caleb. Setbacks came in clusters. A rainstorm in the 3rd week of October turned the creek bank clay to soup, and the batch Adeline had mixed for the partition packing dissolved into a gray slurry that ran down the wall and puddled on the floor. She lost 2 days of work. The mule went fully lame. The bad shoulder swelled until Patch could not pull the cart, and Adeline had to carry supplies on her back from the creek, the cedar stands, and Krause's store. The worst setback was deliberate. Adeline went to Krause's on a Thursday to buy the last bundle of milled planks the store had in stock. 8 board feet of pine, enough to complete the upper section of the partition. Krause told her the bundle had been sold an hour earlier. He did not say to whom. Adeline walked outside and saw Rook's clerk loading the planks onto a wagon. The planks were not for building. Rook had no project requiring 8 board feet of pine. He had bought them to ensure Adeline could not finish the wall. Adeline stood in the road and watched the wagon pull away. She had $4.12 left. The partition was 3/4 built. The upper section, the section that held the heat shutter and the critical seal between the warm chamber and the living space, was open. Tobias found the solution. He had her split cedar logs lengthwise, flatten the faces with an adze, and fit them edge to edge like crude planking. The cedar was not as tight as milled pine. It required twice the chinking, but it sealed, and it was free. The morning after the cedar planks went up, Adeline found Rook's clerk standing outside the cave mouth with a measuring tape. He was not measuring the cave. He was measuring the distance from the cave entrance to the property line. Adeline asked him to leave. He said he was on public right-of-way. Tobias walked up behind the clerk and stood close enough that the man could hear the wheeze in his breathing. "I do not know what Rook is measuring," Tobias said quietly, "but I know what I am measuring. I am measuring how long it takes a man to walk from here to the property line. If you are still here when I finish counting, we will see which measurement matters more." The clerk left. Tobias coughed for 10 minutes afterward, bent double with his hands on his knees. When he straightened, there was blood on his palm. Unexpected help came from the last person Adeline expected. Naomi Papé arrived after dark on a night in late October, carrying 2 planks under her arm. They were smokehouse planks, thick, seasoned, stained dark with creosote from years of hanging meat. She set them against the cave wall without ceremony. "I still think you are wrong," Naomi said. "But children should not freeze because adults are proud." Adeline used the planks to double seal the area around the service door, the weakest point in the partition. The creosote soaked wood was denser than anything else in the wall. Tobias said it would hold. Naomi did not stay. She did not help with the construction. She delivered the planks and left, and in the morning Adeline found a sack of dried beans sitting on the crate outside the cave mouth with no note attached. By the second week of November, the partition was complete. It stood across the 13-foot wide throat of the cave like a wall in a mine. Rough, dark, sealed with lime and clay and tallow, smelling of cedar and creosote, and something older beneath. The high heat shutter sat 8 feet above the floor, reachable from the sleeping platform. The low return slit ran along the base, 4 inches high and 20 inches wide, covered with a loose flap of rawhide that allowed air to pass but kept debris from sliding through. The service door was 30 inches wide, framed in double cedar, gasketed with 2 layers of rawhide, and latched with a wooden bar that dropped into iron brackets Tobias had forged at a neighbor's anvil. The door was not for daily use. It was for emergencies, a total seal failure, a need to inspect the deep chamber, or a situation Adeline hoped would never come. The living chamber measured roughly 16 by 22 feet. The sleeping platform ran along the south wall, raised 18 inches on stacked limestone. The stove sat near the cave mouth, its pipe run through the rock wall and sealed with clay. A shelf held the candle, the dairy thermometer Adeline had borrowed from Naomi, and a small jar of tallow for the lamp. The floor was swept limestone. The walls were lime-washed white. It looked like a room. It smelled like a room. Behind the sealed partition, in the darkness, the cave breathed on. Ephraim Coates returned on a cold morning in mid-November. He did not announce himself. He rode up, dismounted, tied his horse, and walked into the cave as if checking on livestock. He stood in the center of the living chamber and turned a full circle. He touched the partition wall. He looked at the heat shutter. He held his lantern up and watched the flame. It burned steady and upright. "You built this," he said. It was not a question. Tobias helped. Meckel. Coates knew the name. Everyone in the settlement knew the old guano hauler. "His lungs are no good. He should not be in caves." "He knows that. He came anyway." Coates pressed his palm against the partition, the way Tobias had done on his first visit. His hand lingered on the wood. He could feel the warmth from the other side, faint through the double wall and clay packing, but present, unmistakable. "This is your heat?" he said. "The cave makes its own. I just control how much comes through." Coates dropped his hand. He looked at Adeline the way he might look at a fence line that was holding when he expected it to fall. "It is November," he said. "You have not faced a norther yet. A frosty morning is not a killing cold. When the wind comes down from the plains and the temperature drops 40 degrees before supper, this wall is going to shake. Your vent is going to ice at the edges. Your stovepipe is going to fight the cave draw, and you are going to find out whether theory holds when the ground freezes." "I know," Adeline said. "Do you?" It was not a question either. Coates left. At the cave mouth, he paused and looked back. "I will not stop you," he said, "but I will testify that I warned you. For the record, you already told me that. I am telling you again." He rode out. The sound of hooves on limestone faded. Adeline stood in the living chamber and felt the warmth leaking through the partition above her head, a thin current along the ceiling, barely detectable, but there. The cave was not cold. The front chamber sat at 46 degrees with the vent closed. Not warm, not freezing, a space between. The question was whether that space was enough. The first controlled test came on a frosty morning in late November. Adeline woke to ice on the water bucket near the cave mouth. Outside, the borrowed dairy thermometer read 29 degrees. Inside the front chamber, with the vent closed and the stove cold, it was 46. Adeline climbed onto the sleeping platform and opened the high heat shutter. Tobias stood below, watching the candle on the shelf. Warm air rolled through the gap. It came with the smell, ammonia and damp rot, sharp but not overwhelming. The charcoal cloth over the vent caught the worst of it. The warmth spread along the ceiling, pooled against the lime-washed stone, and began settling into the room. After 5 minutes, the thermometer on the shelf near the vent read 52 degrees. After 8 minutes, 55. After 10 minutes, 58. At 10 minutes, Adeline looked at the candle. The flame had begun to lean, not drastically, but visibly. The natural outflow was weakening against the force of the warm inflow. She closed the shutter. The flame straightened. The smell faded within a minute as the natural draw reasserted itself. The warmth remained. The stone bench near the wall was warm to the touch. The ceiling held heat the way a cast iron pan holds heat, slowly releasing what it had absorbed. "Good," Tobias said. He was watching her, not the thermometer. "You were tempted to keep it open. You shut it anyway. That is the discipline." The room held above 50 for an hour. Then it began to settle back toward the baseline. By noon, with weak sun warming the cave mouth, the front chamber was 52 without the vent. A 12-degree improvement over the outside temperature, sustained by rock mass and the residual warmth from a single 10-minute vent opening. It was not summer comfort. It was not cabin comfort. But it was the difference between sleeping in a frozen space and sleeping in a cool one, and for 2 children and a woman who had been told she would die in this cave, the difference felt vast. The skeptics were not moved. Coates had predicted this. 58 degrees on a frosty morning was not proof of anything, except that a warm cave could take the edge off a mild cold snap. The real test, the norther, the killing cold, the ice storm that turned cedar to glass and froze cattle standing in their tracks, had not come. Naomi visited the following week. She brought nothing this time. She walked into the front chamber, looked at the thermometer on the shelf, and said, 51 degrees. My house was 48 this morning, and I have a stove and a chimney. I have a stove too, Adeline said. You have a volcano behind a wall. Naomi touched the partition. The children still smell like cave. The children are warm. Naomi did not argue. She stood in the living chamber for a long time, looking at the whitewashed walls, the sleeping platform, the shelf with the candle and thermometer, the charcoal cloth hanging over the sealed heat shutter. She was doing arithmetic in her head, the arithmetic of a practical woman who had been certain this would fail and was now less certain. She did not say so. She left. But she did not leave beans this time. She left a jar of peach preserves, and preserves were not survival food. Preserves were something you brought when you were visiting a neighbor. December passed in a rhythm of cold mornings, measured vent openings, and the slow accumulation of small victories. Butter softened on the shelf near the upper wall. Beans cooked faster when the chamber was pre-warmed. The children slept without seeing their breath for the first time since August. Adeline tracked everything. She marked the thermometer readings on a slate Minnie used for schoolwork. Outside temperature, front chamber baseline, peak temperature after venting, time to return to baseline. The numbers told a story. The cave system worked within limits. On a 30-degree morning, the front chamber could be raised to the upper 50s. On a 25-degree morning, it reached the low 50s. The heat was real and renewable. The deep chamber's temperature never dropped because the decomposition and the limestone mass fed it constantly. But the limits were also real. The vent could not stay open for more than 15 minutes without the candle flame changing. The charcoal cloth needed replacing every 3 days. The service door gaskets dried and cracked in the cave air and had to be resealed with tallow. And on damp days with a south wind, the system stalled entirely. The outflow reversed. Fumes pooled in the ceiling, and Adeline had to seal the vent and wait for the wind to shift. These were manageable problems. They were the problems of a system that worked. The unmanageable problem was still coming. Telegraph riders passing through the settlement brought news from the north. Cattlemen on the plains were talking about a hard winter shaping up, the kind that killed stock in the open and broke men who were not prepared. The air in mid-December turned too still. Birds vanished from the cedar breaks. The sky on the northern horizon took on a color the old-timers recognized. Blue-black, flat, heavy with something that was not rain. Tobias sat outside the cave mouth on a December evening and watched the northern sky. "That color," he said. "I have seen it twice. Both times people died." Adeline looked north. The sky was darker than it should have been for the time of day. The cedars on the ridge stood motionless. There was no wind at all. "How long?" she asked. "Could be a week. Could be a month. When it comes fast." He coughed. The cough was worse now. It woke him at night and kept him sitting upright because lying flat made it harder to breathe. The cave work had cost him. Every half day he spent inside the front chamber, even with the vent sealed, exposed his damaged lungs to trace fumes that healthy tissue could handle and his could not. He did not stop coming, but he came later and left earlier, and the blood on his handkerchief was no longer something he bothered to hide. The Black Norther hit on a January morning in 1886. The day began warm, shirt-sleeve warm, an unseasonal warmth that made the air feel wrong, as if the weather were holding its breath. Adeline stepped out of the cave mouth at dawn and felt south wind on her face, soft, humid, carrying the smell of rain that had not yet fallen. The thermometer read 54 degrees. Caleb ran in the cedars. Minnie washed clothes at the creek. By 10 in the morning, the wind stopped. The stillness was absolute. No bird sound, no insect hum. Nothing moved in the cedar breaks. The mule stood with his head low and his ears back, facing south, the way animals stand when they sense something coming that they cannot see. By noon, the northern sky was black, not dark, not cloudy, black. A wall of darkness that stretched from horizon to horizon and rose higher every time Adeline looked at it. The edge of the front was visible, a line where the warm southern air met the cold northern mass, and the collision was producing a darkness that looked like smoke from a grass fire that covered the entire world. Dust came first, a fine grit that stung the skin and turned the air yellow. Then the temperature began to fall. It fell fast, not the gradual cooling of a normal front. A collapse. The thermometer on the post outside the cave mouth dropped from 54 to 41 in the time it took Adeline to haul water from the creek. By the time she returned, it was 37. The south wind was gone. The north wind had arrived, and it was not wind. It was force, a physical pressure that bent the cedars sideways and drove grit into every crack and fold. Adeline grabbed Caleb from the cedar stand and pulled Minnie from the creek bank. She hauled the water bucket, the firewood she had stacked under the overhang, and the last sack of cornmeal into the front chamber. She staked the mule in the deepest alcove of the overhang, where the rock wall blocked the north wind. Then she sealed the cave mouth with the canvas tarp she had hung for a door and weighted it with stones. The temperature kept falling, 32, 28, 24. The sleet arrived, not rain, not snow, but ice driven sideways by a wind that screamed through the cedars like something alive. The canvas tarp bowed inward with each gust. Ice formed on the outside within an hour. By nightfall, the thermometer read 14 degrees and was still dropping. Adeline's first crisis was not the cold, it was control. Caleb was coughing. The sound was wet and deep, the remnant of the summer fever that had never fully cleared his chest. He sat on the sleeping platform, wrapped in both quilts, shivering. Minnie pressed against him with her arm around his shoulders. The front chamber, sealed and still, sat at 38 degrees, cold enough to see breath, cold enough that the water bucket near the stove had a skin of ice forming at the edges. The stove was lit. Cedar burned in the firebox, orange light leaking through the crack, but the stove was fighting the cave draw. The natural airflow pulled smoke backward into the chamber instead of up the pipe, and the room was filling with a haze that made Minnie's eyes water. Adeline made the first decision. She dampened the stove, banked the fire to embers, sealed the flue crack with wet cloth, and cut the airflow until the smoke stopped. The stove's heat output dropped to almost nothing. The front chamber lost its only conventional heat source. Now there was only the cave. She climbed onto the sleeping platform. The heat shutter was above her. The tin flap Tobias had bent from salvaged stovepipe, set in the upper section of the partition wall. On the other side, the deep chamber breathed. She could feel the warmth radiating through the double wall, faint but steady. The decomposing guano, the limestone mass, the trapped heat of 1,000,000 bats and a century of accumulated organic matter. All of it sat behind this wall, generating temperatures near 90 degrees in the upper pockets, while her children shivered in 38-degree air 10 feet away. She opened the shutter. Warm air poured through. It came with a smell, sharper than usual, because the cold outside had increased the pressure differential between the warm, deep chamber and the cold front chamber. The draft was strong. The charcoal cloth over the vent fluttered and pressed outward. The ammonia hit Adeline's nose and made her eyes sting. The warmth spread across the ceiling. The thermometer on the shelf began to climb. 40, 42, 45. Caleb stopped shivering. His cough continued, but the convulsive shuddering eased. Minnie looked up at the ceiling and said, "It is warm up here." "Stay low," Adeline said. "The heat gathers high. So does the bad air." She watched the candle. The flame leaned slightly toward the entrance. Good. The natural draw was pulling fumes out. The system was working. After 10 minutes, the thermometer read 52. The candle flame was steady. Adeline closed the shutter. The warmth lingered. The stone bench along the wall was warm to the touch. The limestone ceiling radiated stored heat downward. The chamber began to cool. After 30 minutes, it was 47. Adeline opened the shutter again. Another 10-minute cycle. The temperature climbed back to 54. She closed it. This was the rhythm Tobias had taught her. Short pulls, measured heat, discipline over comfort. The cave was not a fireplace she could tend. It was a force she could negotiate with, in 10-minute intervals, watching a candle flame for the signal that meant the difference between warmth and death. If you are invested in this story, stay with us, because Adeline's next choice could warm the room or poison everyone inside it. The storm did not ease. It worsened. By midnight, the wind had shifted from north to northwest, and the angle drove sleet directly into the cave mouth. The canvas tarp tore along the upper edge. Ice and grit sprayed into the front section of the overhang. The temperature outside was somewhere below zero. The thermometer's mercury had retreated into the bulb and stopped moving. The wind was the thing now. The wind carried a cold that was not temperature, but violence. Adeline hung the spare quilt over the torn tarp and weighted it with the heaviest stones she could lift. The patch held for an hour. Then the wind found the gap again, and cold air flooded the front of the overhang like water breaching a levee. The stove pipe began to rattle. The draft reversal worsened. The wind outside was so strong it was pushing air down the pipe into the firebox. Smoke pulsed into the chamber. Adeline sealed the stove entirely. No fire. No conventional heat. The cave system was all she had. She opened the heat shutter and left it open. This was the thing Tobias had warned her never to do. He had said it in the clearest language he had. Never leave the vent open for comfort. The warm air felt like salvation, and salvation could poison you. But the alternative was a chamber dropping toward freezing with 2 children inside, one of them coughing, and a storm that showed no sign of breaking. She compromised. She opened the high shutter fully and cracked the service door 2 fingers width. The double opening created a stronger draw. Warm air pulled through the upper vent, circulated across the ceiling, and the cooler air was sucked back through the cracked service door at floor level. The circulation was faster than a single vent allowed. More heat, more fumes. She held the wet charcoal cloth over the service door gap. She watched the candle. She counted heartbeats because she had no clock. The warmth built. 56, 58, 60. The children stopped shivering entirely. Minnie stood on the sleeping platform and said her face felt like summer, while her feet felt like winter. Adeline ordered everyone down. Heat stratified. The bad air rode with it. The safest place was the floor. She counted 400 heartbeats, roughly 5 minutes, and closed the service door. She left the high shutter open for another 3 minutes, watching the candle. The flame leaned toward the vent. The threshold was close. She closed the shutter. The chamber held at 61 degrees. The stone bench radiated. The limestone walls and ceiling, saturated with warmth from the upper airflow, gave back their stored heat slowly. For 20 minutes, the cave was warm enough that Caleb fell asleep without coughing. Then the temperature began to drop again, and Adeline climbed onto the platform and started another cycle. She did this all night. Every 20 to 25 minutes, she opened the high shutter, cracked the service door if the temperature had dropped below 50, counted heartbeats, watched the flame, closed the system, and waited. She did not sleep. She could not afford to. A vent left open too long while she dozed could fill the ceiling with enough ammonia and carbon dioxide to sicken the children before they woke. Tobias was not there. He had left 2 days earlier to haul a load of lime from a supplier south of New Braunfels. The norther had trapped him at Naomi Pape's place, 8 miles away, behind impassable ice on the road. Adeline was alone with the system, and the system was everything Tobias had taught her, condensed into a rhythm she repeated through the longest night of her life. Outside, the settlement was failing. Rook's rental cabins, 4 of them, built quickly the previous summer to catch the wagon road traffic he expected, had thin roofs and single-wall chinking. He had used green lumber because it was cheaper. The lumber had shrunk as it cured, opening gaps in every wall. The chinking was lime plaster over cotton batting, and the wind found every seam. The first roof peeled at 2 in the morning. The wind caught a loose shake on the northeast corner and tore the whole section away like opening a can. The family inside, she, a hired hand named Cale Bruckner, his wife, and their infant, fled to the second cabin. Two families in a one-room cabin with a stove that could not keep pace with the heat loss through walls that might as well have been canvas. Coates's cattle drifted into wire fences and froze in piles. The animals pressed against the fence line, unable to turn, unable to move, and the cold killed them standing. By morning, 37 of his 80 head were dead, stiff-legged, ice-rimed, stacked against the wire like cordwood. Naomi Pape's youngest, a boy of 2, developed blue lips and shallow breathing in the early hours. Naomi piled every blanket in the house on him and heated stones in the stove and packed them around his body, but the cabin temperature sat at 29 degrees and would not rise. The stove burned 3/4 cords of cedar through the night and could not overcome the wind forcing cold air through the walls. Cal Bruckner tried to cross from the second cabin to the barn at dawn to check the stock. He made it 40 feet. The wind knocked him flat, and the cold did the rest. Naomi's husband found him an hour later, half conscious, propped against a fence post with ice in his eyebrows and his fingers white inside his gloves. And Rook. Marcellus Rook, who had built 4 cabins for profit and had kept the best for himself, stood in his parlor at 3 in the morning and watched frost form on the inside of his window glass. The stove was roaring. The woodpile outside was buried under ice. His teenage daughter, Lenora, sat by the stove with her hands in flour sacks because her gloves had been packed in a trunk that was frozen shut. The cabin was 26 degrees inside. Rook knew where the cave was. Everyone in the settlement knew. The Bat Privy, the Guano Mansion, the place they had laughed about at Krause's store, the place that smelled like death, the place Marcellus Rook had given to a widow as a punishment disguised as mercy. He left his cabin at dawn carrying Lenora on his back because her boots had frozen to the floor and she could not walk in the stockings that remained. 2 of his tenants followed, Cale Bruckner, half conscious and supported by his wife, and another family whose cabin had lost its door to the wind. They arrived at Devil's Breath Cave in a line of hunched, ice-crusted figures, and Rook pounded on the timber partition with his fist and shouted Adeline's name. Adeline heard the pounding from inside. She had been running vent cycles for 9 hours. The front chamber was 59 degrees. The children were asleep on the platform. The candle burned steady on the shelf. Outside the cave, the wind shrieked. Inside, the air was warm and still and smelled faintly of ammonia and cedar ash. She looked at the cave mouth. The canvas tarp was shredded. Beyond it, the figures were visible in the gray dawn light, hunched, shaking, carrying children. Rook's face was white. Lenora's hands were wrapped in flour sacks stained with something dark. Letting them in would increase the air demand. 13 people breathing in a 16 by 22-foot chamber meant more carbon dioxide, more moisture, more strain on a system designed for 3. Every vent cycle would need to be longer or more frequent. The risk of fume exposure would multiply. Refusing them meant Lenora might lose her fingers. Cale Bruckner might die. The children in the other families might not survive another hour in the open. Adeline stood at the cave mouth and looked at Marcellus Rook. He was the man who had taken her land, bought the lumber to stop her building, sent his clerk to measure her cave, spread jokes through the store, and offered her $5 to disappear. He was the man who had told her she was given what her husband's debt was worth. "Say it," Adeline said. Rook stared at her. The wind tore at his coat. Ice was forming on his collar. "Say the front chamber is mine. Say the valley deed was coerced. Say it so everyone here hears it." Rook's mouth opened. His jaw worked. Lenora shivered against his back, and the flour sacks on her hands were stiff with cold. "The front chamber is yours," Rook said. His voice was hoarse. The valley deed was, I pressured you. I used the debt to take your land. Everyone here hears it. Coates heard it. He had arrived minutes earlier, his face raw and his cattle dead, standing at the cave mouth with the expression of a man watching the world rearrange itself. Naomi heard it. She had come with her youngest bundled against her chest, blue-lipped and barely conscious, carried through the ice because the cabin could not keep him alive. Tobias heard it. He had walked the last 2 miles from Naomi's place through the norther, frost-burned and coughing blood, his scarf frozen to his beard. He stood at the cave mouth and leaned against the stone wall and said nothing. Come in, Adeline said. Stay below shoulder height. Do not touch the partition wall. Do not open the upper shutter. I will manage the heat. They came in, 13 people in a space built for 3. The front chamber filled with bodies, breath, the smell of wet wool and ice and fear. The temperature dropped 5 degrees in 10 minutes from the open cave mouth and the cold radiating off their clothes. Adeline closed the canvas as best she could. She climbed onto the platform. She opened the high shutter. Warm air poured in. She counted heartbeats. She watched the flame. She closed the shutter. She waited. She opened it again. With 13 people inside, 1 small stove banked to embers and controlled heat pulls every 20 minutes, the front chamber held between 58 and 64 degrees through the rest of the day and the following night. Not comfort, not summer. But the shivering stopped. Cale Bruckner's hands warmed enough that the blood returned, and Naomi said the color meant he would keep his fingers. Naomi's youngest son stopped turning blue and began to cry, which meant he had the energy to cry, which meant the cold was retreating from his chest. Lenora Rook sat against the cave wall with her hands unwrapped for the first time since the storm began. The flour sacks had stuck to her skin with frozen moisture. Adeline soaked them loose with warm water heated near the vent, working slowly so the fabric did not tear the skin beneath. Lenora looked up at her father, who was sitting in the corner of the cave with his knees drawn up and his broadcloth coat ruined, and said nothing. Someone nearly died without the cave. Cale Bruckner would have frozen against that fence post if no shelter had existed within walking distance. Naomi's son would have slipped further. Rook's own daughter would have lost fingers, perhaps a hand. The cave held. The partition held. The system held. Not because it was perfect, but because a widow with a candle and a count of heartbeats had measured something the men who laughed at her had never bothered to measure. The temperature of the breath that came from the dark. By the second morning, the wind died. The sky cleared to a brittle blue. Ice covered every surface for miles. The cedars looked like glass. The road was impassable. Rook's cabins were visible from the bluff. 3 with roofs torn or collapsed, the 4th standing but hollow-looking like a skull. The cave was the only shelter in the settlement that did not freeze hard inside, and everyone who had been inside it knew it, because they had felt the warmth move above them like something alive, while the worst northern memory tried to kill everything it touched. Chunk 3 continues. The morning after the norther broke, Adeline opened the canvas tarp and stepped outside into a world that looked like it had been dipped in glass. Every branch, every stone, every blade of dead grass was encased in ice. The cedars on the ridge stood rigid and glittering, their limbs bent under a weight they were never meant to carry. The road was gone, buried under a sheet of frozen sleet that reflected the pale January sun with a brightness that hurt the eyes. The air was still. The wind that had screamed for 36 hours had vanished, leaving behind a silence so deep it felt like a sound of its own. The people in the cave began to leave within the hour. They moved slowly, blinking in the light, their bodies stiff from sleeping on limestone. Naomi carried her youngest against her chest. The boy was awake, flushed, breathing. His lips were pink. She did not speak to Adeline as she left. She pressed Adeline's hand once hard and walked out into the ice. Cal Bruckner's wife helped him stand. His fingers were swollen but intact. He nodded at Adeline from the cave mouth, a single dip of the chin that carried more weight than any words he could have assembled. Rook left last. He stood in the front chamber with his ruined coat and his daughter beside him, and he looked at the partition wall as if seeing it for the first time. The tin heat shutter was closed. The charcoal cloth hung still. The candle on the shelf burned straight and steady. The room smelled of cedar ash, sweat, ammonia, and 13 people who had survived a night they should not have survived. He did not thank Adeline. He gathered Lenora and walked out. At the cave mouth, Lenora turned back and looked at the living chamber, the whitewashed walls, the sleeping platform, the stove, the shelf with the thermometer and the candle. She looked at it the way you look at something you want to remember exactly. Then they were gone, and the cave belonged to Adeline again. She stood alone in the front chamber. The temperature read 56 degrees. The charcoal cloth needed replacing. The rawhide gasket on the service door had dried and cracked from the extended use. The water bucket was empty. The cornmeal sack was half gone. She had fed 13 people through the storm. Tobias sat against the cave wall near the entrance. He had not moved since arriving the previous morning. His breathing was shallow and rapid, a whistle on every exhale. His scarf was still frozen to his beard. His hands were white at the fingertips. "You did it without me," he said. "You taught me how. I taught you the pieces. You put them together in a storm with 13 people and no help. That is not teaching. That is knowing." He coughed. The cough bent him forward, and when it passed, the handkerchief he pressed to his mouth was red. Adeline brought him water. She warmed a stone near the vent and placed it against his back. She did not say he should leave the cave. She did not say his lungs were failing. They both knew. The cost of the norther revealed itself over the following days as the ice melted and the settlement took inventory. Rook's cabins were wrecked. 3 had lost roofs entirely. The green lumber and poor construction had offered the wind purchase points that seasoned timber would have denied. The 4th cabin stood but was uninhabitable. The chinking had been blown out in sheets, and the interior had frozen solid. A rocking chair near the window was coated in a 1/4 inch of ice. The stovepipe had separated from the flue and lay across the floor like a broken bone. Coates lost 37 cattle. The animals were frozen against the wire fences in heaps of 3 and 4, their bodies stiff, their hides rimed white. The surviving 43 head were gaunt and shaken, milling in a draw where a limestone overhang had given partial shelter. Coates spent a week hauling the dead ones away from the fence line. The wire had to be replaced. The loss in dollars was more than he was willing to say out loud. Naomi's smokehouse roof was gone. The wind had peeled it clean, and the meat inside 2 hogs worth of cured pork, the family's protein for the rest of winter, was frozen but exposed. Some of it was salvageable, most was not. The settlement's total firewood consumption during the norther was staggering. Families that had 6 cords stacked and split before the storm had burned through 3 or 4 in 36 hours and still could not keep their cabins above freezing. The conventional approach, thick walls, sealed chinking, roaring stove, had been tested against a cold that did not care about convention, and convention had lost. Adeline's cave had used less than a 1/4 cord of cedar through the entire storm. The stove had been banked for most of it. The heat that kept 13 people alive had come from the earth itself, from microbial decomposition in a guano deposit that had been generating warmth for longer than any living person could remember. That number spread through the settlement faster than the jokes had. A quarter cord. Rook's best cabin had burned 3/4 cords and still frozen. The math was not debatable. It was not a matter of opinion or spirit or stubbornness. It was a thermometer reading and a woodpile, and both told the same story. Ephraim Coates came to the cave 5 days after the storm. He did not ride this time. He walked. The roads were still iced, and his surviving horses were too valuable to risk on uncertain footing. He arrived at the cave mouth in the late morning with his hat in his hand and his boots muddy from the thaw. Adeline was inside, resealing the partition gaskets. Tobias was outside in the sun, breathing carefully, watching the cedar breaks for signs of the weather's next move. Coates nodded to Tobias. He stepped inside the front chamber and stood where he had stood 2 months earlier when he had called this place a grave with a view. He turned the same slow circle. He touched the same partition wall. He held his lantern up and watched the same candle flame, steady, straight, undisturbed. The room was different now, not in its structure, which was unchanged, but in its evidence. The limestone walls showed smoke stains from the banked stove. The sleeping platform had been rearranged to fit more bodies. Adeline had not yet moved the extra bedding back. The thermometer on the shelf read 53 degrees, and outside it was 31. The air smelled of lime, cedar ash, and the faint ghost of 13 people's fear. "I called this place a grave," Coates said. He did not look at Adeline. He looked at the partition wall, at the tin heat shutter, at the charcoal cloth. "I said a cave is where animals crawl off to die." "You did. I was wrong." He turned to face her. His expression was not soft. Coates did not do soft. It was the expression of a man revising a calculation. "You made it a fort that runs on bat filth and discipline, but a fort." He crossed the chamber and touched the high shutter. "Show me how the vents work." Adeline showed him. She opened the shutter for a measured count, explained the candle flame signal, showed him the low return slit and the circulation pattern. She explained the damp south wind danger, the 20-minute cycle, the emergency protocol with the cracked service door. Coates listened the way he listened to everything, without interruption, with his eyes on the mechanism, his mind running the logic. When she finished, he said, "This is not a trick. This is engineering." "It is a hot cave with a wall in front of it," Adeline said. "The engineering is in knowing when to close the wall." Coates put his hat back on. He told her he would send a man to help repair the cave mouth tarp. He told her the county would hear about what she had done, whether Rook wanted them to or not. Then he left, and for the first time since the land exchange, Adeline felt something shift in the way the settlement saw her, not from mockery to admiration, but from mockery to attention. They were watching now. They were paying attention. Naomi came next. She arrived 2 days after Coates with her youngest on her hip and her 3 older children trailing behind her. She did not bring food. She brought a slate and a piece of chalk. "Show me," she said. Adeline looked at the slate. "Show you what?" "Everything, the vents, the wall, the rules. My cabin nearly killed my son. I want to understand what you built so I can decide if any of it applies to a house above ground." This was Naomi's conversion. Not emotional, not dramatic, but practical. She had been wrong, and she was the kind of woman who responded to being wrong by learning. Adeline spent an afternoon walking her through the system. She showed her the smoke test, the candle flame signal, the difference between good draw and stalled draw. She explained that not every element transferred to a cabin. The cave's heat source was unique, but the principles of sealing, high-low air circulation, and heat sink stone could improve any shelter. Naomi wrote everything on the slate. She asked questions that were sharp and specific. What thickness of clay packing stops heat transfer versus allows it? How much lime wash per square foot? What is the minimum vent size for a room of a given volume? Adeline answered what she could and said plainly when she did not know. When Naomi left, she paused at the cave mouth and looked back. "I told you I would pray for those children," she said. "I should have been carrying planks instead of prayers." "You carried both," Adeline said. "The planks held the door." Through the rest of January and into February, others came. A rancher's wife from the next valley who had lost her chicken coop and wanted to understand how to build a stone heat sink, a freighter who had been caught on the road during the norther and wanted to know if the warming principle could work in a dugout, a German farmer from the Guadalupe bottoms who had heard about the cave from Coates and wanted to see the partition wall. Adeline taught them all, and she taught them with conditions. "The heat is real," she told each one. "So is the poison. You cannot take the warmth and ignore the danger. Anyone who copies this system without understanding the air rules will hurt someone." She refused to let visitors enter the deep chamber. She refused to draw diagrams of the full system for people she had not personally walked through the logic. She refused to treat the cave as a spectacle. When a man from New Braunfels rode up with a newspaper reporter's notebook and asked to see the bat furnace, Adeline told him the cave was not a furnace and it was not open for tours, and he could write what he liked. The teaching was always specific. She showed people the candle test. She showed them the smoke test. She demonstrated the vent cycle. She explained why the low return slit mattered, why the charcoal cloth was a reminder rather than a filter, why the service door must stay sealed except in emergency. What she could not give them was the cave itself. Not every cave was warm. Not every warm cave was safe. The specific conditions of Devil's Breath, the depth of the guano deposit, the colony size, the limestone mass, the shape of the passage, were not reproducible. What was reproducible were the principles: seal tight, vent high, return low, watch the flame, never trade caution for comfort. Rook's first response to the storm was not surrender. It was revision. Within a week of the norther, he began telling a different story. In this version, he had given Adeline the cave tract knowing its potential. He was the reason she had shelter. The cave was on land he had generously provided, and anyone who sheltered there during the storm owed their survival, in part, to his decision. This story lasted 3 days. Coates killed it at Krause's store on a Tuesday morning. He stood by the counter with his coffee and said, loud enough for every man in the room to hear, that he had been present when Rook pounded on the cave timbers and begged entry. He had heard Rook admit the valley deed was coerced. He had watched Rook carry his daughter into a cave he had called worthless, and he had watched Adeline Keeler let him in despite every reason not to. Naomi confirmed it at the church the following Sunday. She told the women's circle what Rook had said, his exact words, the ones Adeline had required before she opened the cave, and she told them in the quiet, factual tone that made Naomi impossible to dismiss. Rook's revised story collapsed. The settlement did not turn on him violently. They turned on him quietly, which was worse. The men at the store stopped laughing at his jokes. The women stopped buying from his lumber stock. The tenants whose cabins had failed began asking pointed questions about refunds for rent paid on structures that could not survive a storm. Rook was not broken, he was cornered. And cornered men do not retreat, they recalculate. No, February brought a thaw, and with the thaw came the deepening of everything Tobias had given Adeline. They worked together through the mild days. Tobias's lungs were worse. He could manage only 2 or 3 hours inside the cave now, and even those hours cost him iron. The cough was constant, wet, producing the dark phlegm that told Adeline his chest was filling with what the cave air had put there over decades. But he would not stop. He said stopping was the same as dying early, and he preferred to choose his own schedule. They built a safer second vent hood using sheet tin salvaged from Rook's ruined cabin roof. The new hood sat over the high shutter like a chimney cap, angled so that warm air flowing through the vent was directed downward into the room rather than pooling at the ceiling. This reduced the stratification problem, the hot head, cold feet effect that many had described during the norther, and allowed the warmth to distribute more evenly. Tobias forged the hood brackets himself at a neighbor's anvil. His hands were still steady, even as his breathing was not. He worked the bellows with slow, deliberate pumps, and the metal glowed and bent under his hammer with a precision that made Adeline understand the kind of craftsman he had been before the caves took his lungs. They talked while they worked. Not about the system by now. The system was second nature to both of them. They talked about the saltpeter works. Tobias told her about the caves near New Braunfels during the war, when the Confederacy needed gunpowder and the hill country caves held guano rich in nitrates. Men worked in those caves with nothing but candles and shovels, loading hand carts in passages so tight they crawled. The ammonia ate their throats. The dust ate their lungs. 3 men Tobias worked with died before the war ended. Not from bullets, but from breathing. I watched them go, Tobias said. He was sitting outside the cave, catching his breath after installing the hood. The sun was warm. Bats were beginning their evening departure, streaming from the upper crack in a black ribbon against the sky. Aldrich went first. He coughed for a year, and then he stopped coughing, and that was worse. The quiet meant his lungs had given up trying to clear themselves. Bonert lasted longer. He moved to Fredericksburg and thought the clean air would fix him. It did not. Sauer died in the cave itself. He sat down to rest and did not stand up. Adeline listened. She did not say she was sorry. She did not say he was brave. She asked what she could learn from how they died. Tobias looked at her. The scarred tissue on his throat moved when he swallowed. You can learn that the cave does not negotiate. It gives heat, and it takes lungs, and it does not keep a ledger. The only thing between your children and Aldrich's fate is that wall and your discipline. Do not forget it. Not in 10 years. Not in 20. They clashed once, badly. It happened in early March. The weather had turned mild, and Adeline wanted to open the service door fully, not for heat, but for inspection. She wanted to see the condition of the deep chamber, to check whether the winter's cycles had affected the guano deposits, to understand what the system looked like from the other side of the wall. Tobias refused. Not suggested against. Refused. You do not go in there, he said. His voice was harder than Adeline had ever heard it. Not for curiosity, not for inspection, not for any reason that does not involve someone dying on the other side of that door. I need to understand what I'm working with. You understand enough. The chamber is hot, foul, and deep. The deposits shift. The gases pool in pockets that move with the weather. I have seen a man walk into a pocket of carbon dioxide in a cave like this and drop without a sound, no warning, no smell, just down. You went in those caves for years. And I am dying from it. Tobias's voice cracked. The words came out raw, stripped of the careful patience he usually held. I'm dying from walking into caves and breathing what comes out of the stone. You have children. You have a life that works. Do not follow me into the dark because you think understanding requires being inside the thing that kills you. Adeline did not open the service door. She stood at the partition wall with her hand on the latch and felt the warmth radiating through the wood and clay. On the other side, the cave breathed, its hot, foul, generous, lethal breath pushing steadily through the sealed wall and out through the vent and into the room where her children slept. She let go of the latch. "Thank you," Tobias said. "For what?" "For listening when it mattered." Tobias Meckel died on a warm evening in April. He did not die in the cave. He died sitting outside on the limestone ledge above the entrance, watching the bats leave for their evening hunt. The colony poured from the upper crack in a stream that took 20 minutes to pass. Hundreds of thousands of Mexican free-tailed bats spiraling upward in a column that darkened the sky and filled the air with the soft percussion of wings. Adeline found him when the stream thinned. He was sitting with his back against the bluff, his hands in his lap, his head tilted slightly, as if he had been following the last bats with his eyes. His face was relaxed. The wheeze that had been his constant companion for months was absent. The handkerchief in his pocket was clean. Minnie was the one who said it. She had been sitting 10 feet from Tobias, drawing the bat column on her slate. She looked at him when the last bats cleared the crack and said, "Mama, Mr. Meckel is not breathing." Adeline knelt beside him. She took his hand. It was warm, not cave warm, but sun warm, the warmth of a man who had been sitting in the last light of a spring evening doing the thing he had done all his life, watching caves. She did not cry, not then. She sat beside him for a long time while the sky turned dark and the bats vanished into the distance, and the cave below them breathed its warm, steady breath into the cooling air. His last lesson had not been a technique, it had been a word: restraint. "The cave gives," he had said on one of those half-day mornings when his lungs allowed him to work and his patience allowed him to teach. "It does not forgive." Adeline buried him on the ridge above the cave, where the limestone broke through the cedar roots and the view ran south to the river. She marked the grave with a flat stone and scratched his name and the years into the surface with the back of the hand axe. Minnie left a piece of charcoal cloth on the stone. Caleb left a smooth river pebble. The cave breathed below them. The bats returned at dawn. The secondary crisis came 6 weeks after Tobias's death, and it came wearing Marcellus Rook's ambition like a coat. Rook had been quiet since the Norther. The settlement's attention had shifted away from him, and attention was the currency Rook valued most. Adeline's cave was the story now, the widow's warm room, the bat heat shelter, the place that held when everything else broke. Every conversation at Krause's store eventually circled back to it. Every family that had sheltered there during the storm told the story to every family that had not. Rook could not compete with the story, so he decided to exploit its source. In mid-March, he hired 2 men, laborers from San Antonio, not locals, and brought them to the cave tract. His claim was simple. The guano deposits in the deep chamber were a mineral resource, separate from the residential use of the front chamber. Texas mineral rights could be filed independently of surface rights. If the guano was worth money as fertilizer and bat guano was selling for $10 to $15 a ton in San Antonio, then Rook could file a mineral claim, extract the guano, and profit from the very cave he had tried to use as punishment. Adeline heard the noise before she saw them. The sound of shovels on stone, muffled by the partition wall, coming from somewhere deep in the passage. She pressed her ear to the wall and felt the vibration of metal striking compacted guano. She went outside and circled the bluff. The upper crack, the one the bats used, was too narrow for a man. But there was a second entrance hidden by cedar growth on the south face of the bluff. that Adeline had noticed months earlier and dismissed as too small to matter. Rook's men had widened it with picks. They were inside the deep chamber, shoveling guano into canvas bags. Adeline found Rook standing at the widened entrance with his arms crossed and a legal paper in his coat pocket. "This is my property," Adeline said. "The surface is your property," Rook said. "The mineral deposit is unclaimed. I have filed for extraction rights. You are welcome to continue living in your front room. My men will not disturb you." "Your men are disturbing a sealed cave system that keeps my children alive." "That is not my concern. My concern is the guano, which is a mineral resource, which I have every right to extract." Adeline looked at the widened entrance. The air coming out of it was thick and hot and sharp. The men inside had no charcoal cloth, no wet wool, no candle test. They had shovels and canvas bags and the assumption that a cave was just a hole in the ground. "Your men are going to die in there," she said. "My men know their business." They did not. The collapse happened within the hour. Rook's laborers had been shoveling in a side pocket where the guano deposit was deepest, a low alcove off the main passage where decades of bat waste had accumulated in a thick, compacted layer. The shoveling disturbed the surface crust, releasing gases that had been trapped beneath the compacted upper layer. Carbon dioxide, heavier than air, pooled in the alcove like invisible water. Ammonia, lighter and sharper, rose toward the ceiling. The first man coughed, then staggered, then sat down. The second man shouted his name. The shout cost him the breath he needed. He dropped to one knee, then to both, then flat. Adeline heard the shout from outside. She heard the second man fall. The sound was unmistakable. The clatter of a shovel dropped on stone, the thud of a body hitting packed guano. She ran to the widened entrance. The air coming out was worse now, thick with ammonia, carrying the damp heat of disturbed organic matter. She could see one man's boot in the lantern light, motionless, 6 feet inside the alcove. Rook was standing behind her. His face had changed. The confidence was gone. He was looking at the entrance the way a man looks at a hole that has become a grave. "Do something," he said. Adeline's mind went to Tobias, not to his presence. He was buried on the ridge, but to his lessons, the things he had taught her in those half-day sessions, the pieces she had assembled during the Norther, the discipline that had kept 13 people alive. She did not enter the alcove. Tobias had told her, never go into a pocket, never follow a fallen man into bad air. The instinct to rescue is the instinct that doubles the body count. If this story reminds you why preparation matters, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Adeline's lesson was never that danger disappears, only that knowledge gives danger boundaries. She sent Minnie to the cave mouth to get the rope. She soaked a cloth in water and tied it over her nose and mouth. She tested the air at the entrance with a candle. The flame guttered and leaned wildly. Bad air, moving fast. She did not go in past the white line. Coates arrived within minutes. Naomi came behind him. Adeline gave instructions the way Tobias would have, calm, specific, without room for debate. Rope around the waist of whoever goes closest, short pulls, no heroics. If you feel dizzy, you're already too deep. Back out and let the rope do the work. Coates tied the rope around his own waist. He crouched low. The bad air was thickest near the ceiling, in a side pocket, but the carbon dioxide pooled at the floor. There was a band of breathable air at roughly knee height, narrow and temporary. He crawled in. He reached the first man and hooked the rope under his arms. Adeline and Naomi pulled. The man slid across the guano crust, limp, his face gray. They dragged him into the open air. He was breathing, shallow, rapid, but breathing. Coates went back for the second man. This time was harder. The second man had fallen deeper into the alcove. Coates crawled until the rope went taut, then called for slack. Adeline gave him 6 more feet. He hooked the man and pulled. The effort cost him. When Coates emerged, his face was red and his breathing was ragged. But the second man was out. Both men survived. One vomited for an hour. The other could not stand until the next morning. Neither returned to the cave. Rook stood at the widened entrance and watched his mineral claim dissolve in front of him. The guano was there. The money was there. But the cave would not permit careless extraction, and Rook did not have the knowledge or the patience for careful work. Adeline sealed the widened entrance with stones and clay the following day. She did not ask Rook's permission. She did not consult a lawyer. She stacked the stones, packed the gaps, and lime-washed the surface. When Rook's clerk came to inspect, the entrance was a wall. That was a public access point, the clerk said. That was a death trap, Adeline said. And if Mr. Rook opens it again, the next man who falls will not have me standing outside with a rope. The clerk left. Rook did not reopen the entrance. The weeks after the guano crisis changed the balance of the settlement in ways that the norther had begun but not completed. During the storm, Adeline had been a survivor, a woman who endured. After the rescue, she was something different. She was the person who knew. When a problem involved the cave, the heat, the air, the danger, Adeline was the authority. Not Coates, who had the years and the cattle. Not Rook, who had the money and the legal connections. Adeline, who had a candle and a count of heartbeats and a dead mentor's voice in her head. People came to her now, not to the cave, to her. A rancher whose root cellar flooded every spring asked her how to vent moisture without losing stored heat. She showed him the high-low principle and helped him cut 2 vents in his stone walls. A woman whose cabin chimney drew badly asked her to test the airflow. Adeline used Tobias's smoke test, punk cedar on a tin plate, and found the blockage in 30 seconds. Minnie began teaching the younger children in the settlement how to read a candle flame. She would light a tallow candle in a doorway and show them. Straight flame meant good air, lean meant draft. Flicker meant turbulence. Blue base meant poison. The children learned it as a game. Their parents learned it as a tool. Adeline added a second clay-packed wall layer to the partition, a stone bench heat sink along the inner wall, a drip gutter to keep condensation away from the bedding, and a marked red line on the floor beyond which no visitor crossed. She learned when not to use the heat. Damp south wind trapped fumes. Dry north wind drew better. She developed a weather sense that was not superstition, but observation. The quality of the light, the behavior of the birds, the direction of smoke from the cedar breaks. She was no longer copying Tobias's old guano works knowledge. She was extending it. The student had outlived the teacher and carried the teaching into territory the teacher had never mapped. And somewhere to the north, in a county office in New Braunfels, Marcellus Rook was filing a new claim. Not for mineral rights this time, for the cave tract itself. His argument: Adeline had failed to improve the land within the meaning of Texas homestead law, because a cave was not a lawful structure and therefore did not constitute improvement. The paper sat in a drawer, waiting for a hearing date. Adeline did not yet know it existed, but the clock that had stopped when the norther broke was ticking again, and this time the threat was not cold. It was law. The first sign of wit born was a sound, the ring of a hammer on an anvil that did not belong to anyone in the settlement. Adeline heard it on a morning in late April, carried on the south wind from the road below the bluff. She walked to the edge of the overhang and looked down. A man was working at a portable forge set up on the back of a freight wagon. He was bending a piece of strap iron into a curve, holding it with tongs, his shirt sleeves rolled to the elbows. The hammer blows were even and patient. Each strike landed where the last one had, building the curve degree by degree. He looked up and saw her watching. He did not wave. He did not call out. He tipped his hat, a brief gesture, almost formal, and went back to the iron. Whit Boren was 38 years old, a mule freighter and blacksmith's son who ran goods between San Antonio and Fredericksburg. He had heard the cave story from a stock buyer in Comfort and had come to see the road, not the cave. The road past Adeline's Bluff was part of a route he was considering for a regular freight run, and he needed to know if the grade was passable for a loaded wagon. Adeline did not seek him out. He came to the cave 2 days later, carrying a section of scrap tin and a handful of iron hinges. "I heard you have vent shutters that stick," he said. Adeline looked at the tin and the hinges. "Who told you that?" "Mrs. Pape. She said the tin warps in the heat and the hinges corrode in the damp." "She is correct. I can forge hinges that resist the damp. Brass pins instead of iron. The tin I can double fold so it holds its shape. May I see the shutters?" Adeline let him in. She watched him examine the heat shutter with the attention of a man who understood metal and did not pretend to understand caves. He measured the shutter frame with a folding rule. He tested the hinge by opening and closing it 12 times and noting where the resistance increased. He did not touch the partition wall. He did not look through the vent. He did not ask how the cave worked. "I can have new hinges in 2 days," he said. "The tin will take a week. I will need measurements for the return slit flap as well." "What do you want for the work?" "A place to water my mules on the next run-through. Your creek is the only reliable water between here and the Guadalupe Ford." The exchange was practical. Mule water for metalwork. It was the kind of trade that happened 100 times a week in the hill country, and it carried no sentiment. But Adeline noticed that Whit followed her safety rules without being told. He stayed below shoulder height near the partition. He did not touch the charcoal cloth. When he worked inside the cave, he watched the candle flame the way she did, automatically, the way a person watches the road while driving a team. She noticed. She did not comment on it, but she noticed. Chunk 4 continues. The county surveyor arrived on a Tuesday morning in May, riding a bay horse with a transit level strapped to the saddle and a leather case of papers on his hip. His name was Dunning. He was a thin man with clean boots and the expression of someone who had been told this would be simple. Rook rode beside him. He had dressed for the occasion. Clean coat, pressed shirt, the broadcloth vest he wore when he wanted to look like a man of business rather than a man of schemes. He had a folded document in his breast pocket, and he touched it every few minutes the way a man touches a weapon he has not yet decided to draw. They stopped at the cave mouth. Dunning dismounted and began setting up his transit on the flat ground in front of the entrance. Rook stayed on his horse and looked at the bluff the way a man looks at something he intends to own by sundown. Adeline was inside, teaching Naomi's oldest boy the candle flame test, when Minnie came running in from the overhang. "Mama, Mr. Rook is here. He brought a man with measuring tools." Adeline set down the candle. She walked to the cave mouth and saw the transit, the surveyor, and Rook on his horse. "Mrs. Keeler," Dunning said. He touched his hat. "I am here on a county matter. Mr. Rook has filed a petition challenging your improvement claim on this parcel. The county requires a site inspection before the hearing." "What is the challenge?" Dunning opened the leather case and read from the petition. The language was legal, but the argument was plain. Rook claimed that Adeline had not constructed a permanent dwelling or agricultural improvement on the 80-acre tract as required by Texas homestead law. A cave, Rook argued, was a natural formation, not a built structure. Living inside a cave did not constitute improvement any more than sleeping under a tree constituted building a house. The partition wall, the vents, the stove installation, these were modifications to a natural feature, not construction of a dwelling. Therefore, Adeline had failed to improve the land, the homestead claim was void, and the tract reverted to its previous status, available for purchase by any interested party. The interested party, of course, was Rook. Adeline listened without interrupting. When Dunning finished, she said, "When is the hearing?" 3 weeks, county courthouse in New Braunfels. I will be there. Rook spoke for the first time. Mrs. Keeler, this does not need to go to hearing. I will offer you $15 for a quitclaim. That is 3 times what I offered before the winter. You have proven your resourcefulness. Take the money and find proper shelter. The cave is proper shelter, Mr. Rook. You know that better than most. You slept in it. Rook's face tightened. The broadcloth vest rose and fell with a breath that was not quite steady. Dunning looked between them with the expression of a man who understood that this survey was not about measurements. Dunning spent 2 hours measuring. He documented the cave dimensions, the overhang, the front chamber, the partition wall. He noted the stove, the sleeping platform, the limestone bench, the vent system. He asked Adeline to demonstrate the heat shutter. She opened it for a measured count and closed it. He wrote something on his notepad and underlined it. When he left, he told Adeline the inspection report would be submitted to the county before the hearing. He did not tell her what the report would say. His face, as he packed the transit, suggested that what he had seen was not what he had expected to find. The 3 weeks before the hearing were the strangest Adeline had experienced since the land exchange. The threat was not cold. It was not wind. It was not the ammonia on the other side of the partition wall. It was paper. A legal petition in a leather case, filed by a man who had already taken her land once and was now attempting to take what he had given her as punishment. The irony was precise enough to cut. Rook had forced the cave tract on Adeline because it was worthless. She had made it valuable. Now he wanted it back because she had made it valuable. The circle was complete, and Adeline was standing in the center of it with her children, her candle, and the thermometer that had measured the difference between survival and death. She could not afford a lawyer. $11 would not buy an hour of legal counsel in New Braunfels. What she had instead were witnesses. People who had been inside the cave during the norther. People who had seen the partition, the vents, the system. People who had felt the warmth and heard Rook's confession and watched his daughter's hands unwrapped from frozen flour sacks. Coates came to the cave a week before the hearing. He sat on the limestone bench and told Adeline he would testify. He did not offer comfort or prediction. He said he would state what he had seen and what he had heard, and the county could make of it what it would. Naomi came the next day. She brought the slate on which she had recorded the cave specifications, vent dimensions, wall thickness, temperature readings, and said she would present it as evidence of deliberate construction. Whitbourne came without being asked. He had finished the replacement hinges and the double-folded tin shutter 2 weeks earlier, and he had returned 3 times since that, once to adjust the return slit flap, once to repair the stovepipe, and once for no stated reason at all. He told Adeline he would testify about the metalwork in the cave, the forged brackets, the hinges, the vent hardware, and that any reasonable person who examined the structure would conclude it was built, not found. The strongest witness, though, was one Adeline had not expected. Lenora Rook was 17. She had her father's dark hair and her mother's silence. Her mother had died 4 years earlier, and Lenora had grown up in the space between Rook's ambition and the world's indifference to a girl without a mother. She was not rebellious. She was not dramatic. She was simply honest, in the way that young people are honest when they have not yet learned that honesty is expensive. She came to the cave alone, on foot, 3 days before the hearing. She stood at the entrance and asked if she could come in. Adeline let her. Lenora walked through the front chamber the way she had walked through it during the norther, slowly, looking at everything: the walls, the shelf, the candle, the partition. She stopped at the sleeping platform and touched the edge of it. "My father is going to try to take this from you," she said. "I know. He told me not to come here. I know that, too." Lenora looked at her hands. The flour sack burns had healed, but the skin on 3 of her fingers was tight and shiny, scar tissue from the cold damage. She would carry those marks for the rest of her life. "I am going to testify," Lenora said. "I'm going to tell the county what happened the night of the storm, what my father said, what you did." Adeline looked at the girl standing in the cave that had saved her fingers and possibly her life. She saw the cost of what Lenora was offering: a daughter contradicting her father in a public hearing, in a county where family loyalty was the first and last currency. "You do not have to do that," Adeline said. "I know I do not have to. I want to, because what happened in this cave was real, and my father is trying to make it disappear." Lenora left. Adeline stood in the front chamber and felt the weight of what was coming. Not the cold, not the wind, not the ammonia, but the simple human question of whether truth carried more weight than paper. The hearing was held in the Como County Courthouse in New Braunfels on a warm May morning. The room was small: a judge's bench, 2 tables, a gallery with wooden chairs that held perhaps 30 people. Every chair was full. The settlement had come to watch. Rook sat at the left table with a lawyer from San Antonio, a man named Prescott who wore a city suit and spoke with the confidence of someone who had never been inside a bat cave. Adeline sat at the right table, alone. She had no lawyer. She had a borrowed dress, a slate with temperature readings, and 5 witnesses sitting in the gallery. Prescott presented Rook's case with the efficiency of a man who believed the law was on his side. A cave was a natural formation. Homestead law required construction of a permanent dwelling. No reasonable interpretation of dwelling included a cave with a wooden wall inside it. The partition was a modification, not a structure. Mrs. Keeler had not improved the land. The claim was void. The judge, or a lean man named Hargrove, who had been on the bench for 11 years, listened without expression. When Prescott finished, he turned to Adeline. "Mrs. Keeler, you have no counsel?" "No, sir. I have witnesses." "Call them." Coates went first. He stood with his hat in his hands and spoke in the flat, measured tone of a man who had testified before and did not embellish. He described the cave as he had first seen it: empty, foul, unimproved. Then he described the cave as it stood now: a sealed living chamber with a double-walled partition, controlled ventilation, a stove installation, a sleeping platform, limestone benches, and a heat management system that had kept 13 people alive during the worst norther the settlement had seen. "Is the partition a permanent structure?" Hargrove asked. "It is more permanent than 3 of Mr. Rook's cabins," Coates said. "Those are gone. The partition is still standing." The gallery stirred. Prescott objected. Hargrove allowed the answer to stand. Naomi testified next. She presented the slate with the temperature readings: outside versus inside, baseline versus vented, storm night versus calm morning. She described the construction in detail: the double wall, the clay and straw packing, the lime wash, the rawhide gaskets, the vent shutters, the return slit. She described it as a woman who had examined it with the critical eye of a neighbor who had initially believed it would fail. "Mrs. Pape," Hargrove said, In your judgment, is this structure the result of deliberate construction? It is the result of 5 weeks of labor by a woman with a hand axe and a mallet, Naomi said. She drilled post sockets into limestone with a star drill. She hauled clay in coffee tins. She split cedar logs for planking. If that is not construction, I do not know what the word means. Whitbourne testified about the metalwork, the forged brackets, the brass pin hinges, the double-folded tin shutters. He brought the original iron hinges Tobias had made, corroded and replaced, and the new brass pin hinges he had forged as replacements. He set them on the judge's bench side by side. "These are hardware," Whit said. "Hardware belongs in a structure, not in a hole in the ground." The rescued guano worker, a man named Padilla who had come from San Antonio for the hearing, testified that Adeline had organized the rescue that saved his life and his partner's life after Rook's unsupervised extraction attempt. He described the air in the deep chamber, the speed of the collapse, and the discipline of the rescue, the rope, the wet cloth, the instruction to stay low, the refusal to send anyone past the safe line. Prescott objected that the guano incident was irrelevant to the improvement claim. Hargrove overruled him. "It speaks to the nature of the structure and the knowledge required to maintain it," the judge said. "I will hear it." Then Lenora stood. The gallery went quiet. Rook turned in his chair. Prescott leaned forward. Hargrove watched with the careful attention of a judge who understood that what was about to happen would determine the outcome more than any legal argument. Lenora spoke simply. She described the night of the Norther. She described her father's cabin failing, the cold inside, the stove that could not keep pace, the boots frozen to the floor. She described the walk to the cave, carried on her father's back, her hands in flour sacks, the wind so loud she could not hear him breathing. She described arriving at the cave mouth and seeing the timber partition in the lantern light, solid, sealed, warm air leaking from the vent above. She described what her father said when Adeline required the confession. She repeated his words. The gallery heard them for the second time. The valley deed was coerced. The front chamber was Adeline Sabisic. And this time they heard them from the man's own daughter. She described Adeline unwrapping the flour sacks from her hands. She described the warm water, the care, the patience. She held up her hand so the judge could see the scars on her fingers. "Mrs. Keeler sheltered me when my father's cabins failed," Lenora said. "She sheltered all of us. The cave is not a hole in the ground. It is a home that she built with her hands and her knowledge, and it saved my life." Rook did not look at his daughter. He looked at the table. Prescott examined his papers. The gallery was silent. Hargrove ruled from the bench. The partition, the ventilation system, the stove installation, the sleeping platform, the limestone benches, and the heat management apparatus constituted deliberate, permanent improvement to the property. The homestead claim was valid. The petition was denied. Then Hargrove added something that was not required. He noted for the record that the original land exchange between Rook and Mrs. Keeler had been described by multiple witnesses as coerced, and he recommended that the county clerk review the probate file for irregularities. Rook's lawyer began to object. Rook stopped him with a hand on his arm. The broadcloth vest rose and fell. The room waited. "What do you want?" Rook asked. He was not speaking to the judge. He was speaking to Adeline. "The spring rights," Adeline said. "The valley seep on the 42 acres. I do not want the valley land back. I want water rights restored to this tract, and I want a corrected deed that shows the cave parcel was received under duress." Prescott whispered in Rook's ear. Rook shook his head. He signed the corrected deed at the table in front of 30 witnesses with the judge watching and the county clerk recording. The spring rights were restored. The deed was annotated. The record was clean. Rook walked out of the courthouse without speaking to anyone. Prescott followed with his papers. Lenora stayed behind, sitting in the gallery, looking at the signed document on the clerk's desk. Adeline sat beside her, and neither of them spoke for a long time. The season after the hearing was the first time Adeline lived without a threat hanging over the cave. The sensation was unfamiliar. She had spent nearly a year with a clock ticking: winter, Rook, the guano crisis, the legal challenge, and the sudden absence of a deadline left a space she did not know how to fill. She filled it with work. The cave front became, over the following months, what the settlement would eventually call Keeler's Warm Room. The name replaced Bat Privy and Guano Mansion, the way a river replaces the channel it carved, gradually, completely, until the old path was forgotten. The warm room was not a business. Adeline charged no rent during storms. Families came when the weather turned, and they brought what they could: lime, timber, cornmeal, labor. The cave became the settlement's emergency shelter, the place people walked to when the sky turned black and the wind started. Adeline kept the system maintained, the partitions sealed, the vents clean, the charcoal cloth replaced, the candle always burning on the shelf. She also kept the rules. No one entered the deep chamber. No one opened the heat shutter without her permission or Minnie's. No one slept with the vent open. No one crossed the red line on the floor. The rules were not suggestions. They were the difference between the warm room and a grave, and Adeline enforced them with the quiet authority of a woman who had earned the right to say no. A typical storm night at Keeler's Warm Room looked like this: families arriving in the late afternoon as the sky darkened, children carried on hips, blankets bundled under arms, Adeline directing them to places along the walls, families with infants nearest the stone bench, older children on the sleeping platform, men along the far wall where the air was coolest and the draft weakest, the stove banked low, the vent cycles running every 20 minutes, the candle burning on the shelf, Minnie watching the flame. The room held between 15 and 20 people during bad weather. The temperature held between 55 and 62 degrees. The smell was present, always present, but manageable, and after the first hour, no one noticed it. What they noticed was the warmth that came from the earth, through the wall, past the vent, and into a room where children slept without shivering and old men could feel their fingers. Coates never used the word admire. He was not a man who admired, but he began routing his cattle drives along the road below the bluff, which meant his men watered at Adeline's Creek and occasionally carried supplies up the hill without being asked. He told the County Stock Association about the cave at a meeting in New Braunfels, and after that, visitors came from as far as Fredericksburg and Bourne to see the warm room. Naomi built a root cellar with a small warmed stone alcove, not a cave system, but an application of the sealing and heat sink principles Adeline had taught her. The alcove kept her root vegetables above freezing through the winter and saved her from losing 3 months of stored food during the February cold snap the following year. Other adaptations followed. A rancher on the Guadalupe used the high-low vent principle to ventilate a calving shed, reducing the suffocation deaths that had plagued his spring births. A freighter built a sealed stone shelter at a way station using double-wall construction and a heat sink bench modeled on Adeline's design. None of these were cave heat systems. None of them required bats or guano. They were applications of the principles: seal tight, circulate deliberately, store heat in mass, watch the air, that Adeline had learned from Tobias and extended through necessity. Within 3 years of the norther, at least 11 families in the valley used some version of these principles. The warm room itself remained unique. Not every cave was warm, and not every warm cave was safe. Adeline said this to everyone who came, and she said it without pride or false modesty. She said it as a fact, the same way she stated the vent cycle timing or the candle flame signals. The cave had saved them not because caves were safe, but because she had learned to make one safe. The distinction mattered. Whit Boren asked to court Adeline in June, after the legal matter had settled. He did not ask during the hearing or before it. He did not arrive as a rescuer or a provider. He arrived as a man who had been coming to the cave for weeks with metalwork and mule water and no stated reason beyond the next repair, and who had finally run out of repairs to justify the visits. He asked on the ridge above the cave near Tobias's grave on an evening when the bats were leaving. Adeline was sitting on the flat stone she used as a bench, watching the colony stream from the upper crack. Whit sat beside her and said he would like to keep coming to the cave, and he would like a reason that did not involve hinges. Adeline looked at him. She had been alone for more than a year. She had buried a husband and a mentor. She had built a shelter from poison and kept her children alive through a storm that killed cattle in standing piles. She had fought a land speculator twice and won both times. She had done all of this without a partner, and the solitude had become a kind of armor she was not sure she could remove. "I do not need rescuing," she said. "I know," Whit said. "I am not offering rescue. I am offering company. And hinges. And hinges, if you need them." Their courtship happened through work. Whit forged safer vent latches, brass catches that could be operated one-handed from the sleeping platform, so Adeline did not have to climb down and up during the night cycles. Adeline taught him why iron could not be used near the partition. The damp cave air corroded iron within weeks, and a rusted-shut vent latch was a death sentence during a storm. He learned. He did not argue. He modified his designs and brought better ones. They married in the fall at the cave mouth, with Coates as witness and Naomi holding the children. The ceremony was brief. The minister from New Braunfels said the standard words. Whit moved his forge and his mule string to the flat ground below the bluff. Adeline kept the cave. Their partnership was defined by the same principle that defined the cave system. Each part served a function, and neither part tried to do the other's work. Whit handled the freight runs, the metal work, the heavy construction that required a second pair of strong arms. Adeline handled the cave, the vent cycles, the maintenance, the teaching, the judgment calls about when to open and when to seal. He never overruled her on the cave. She never overruled him on the iron. The marriage worked because neither of them confused partnership with ownership. The years compress the way years do when the crisis has passed, and the life that follows is built on what the crisis revealed. Minnie grew into the method's keeper. By 12, she could run a vent cycle alone. By 14, she was teaching adults the candle flame test and the smoke draw and the rules that Adeline had scratched into the limestone wall on her first week in the cave. She kept a temperature log on a school slate, outside readings, inside readings, vent duration, wind direction, and the log became the settlement's most reliable weather record. When the county agricultural agent visited in 1892, he copied Minnie's data into a ledger and said it was the most detailed microclimate record he had seen outside a university. Caleb survived. The thin boy with the summer fever grew into a compact, quiet young man who learned masonry from a German stonemason in New Braunfels and came back to the settlement to build the things his mother could not build alone. He laid the stone foundation for the house that Adeline and Whit eventually built near the cave mouth, a proper house with thick limestone walls, a good chimney, and a root cellar that used the sealing principles Adeline had developed. The house was warm in winter and cool in summer, and it stood 50 feet from the cave entrance, close enough that Adeline could walk to the warm room in 2 minutes when the weather turned. She never moved the candle from the shelf. Even after the house was built, even after the warm room was no longer her primary shelter, the candle burned on the limestone ledge inside the front chamber. Visitors asked why. Adeline said the candle was not for light. It was for listening. The flame told her what the cave was doing, and the cave was always doing something. Witt's freight business grew. The road below the bluff became a regular route, and the creek, fed by the restored spring rights, became a watering stop that freighters planned their schedules around. Witt built a covered trough and a small way station shelter using double-wall construction. Drivers who stopped during winter storms sometimes ended up at the warm room, and they carried the story further to San Antonio, to Austin, to places where people heard about a widow who heated a cave with bat dung and decided it was too strange to be true. It was too strange to be true. It was also true. The distinction was Adeline's life. She kept Tobias's smoke-blackened vent tin over the kitchen door of the stone house. It hung on a nail, too damaged and corroded to use, too important to discard. When Minnie asked why it stayed there, Adeline said it was a reminder that the first version of anything is the one that costs the most. Rook did not leave the settlement. He did not prosper either. The cabins he had built for profit were rebuilt with better materials after the norther, but the reputation stuck. People remembered the roofs that peeled. People remembered the confession at the cave mouth. People remembered Lenora's testimony. Rook continued to buy and sell land, but no one bought his winter cabins and no one asked him for shelter advice. Lenora moved to San Antonio at 19. She did not speak to her father for 3 years. When she returned, it was with a husband and a child, and she visited Adeline before she visited Rook. The visit was brief. Lenora held her daughter up to the cave mouth and let her feel the warm breath coming from the entrance. The little girl wrinkled her nose at the smell. Lenora laughed. It was the first time Adeline had heard her laugh. Adeline Ward Keeler died in 1912, in the stone house near the cave mouth, in a bed her son had built from cedar cut on the ridge where Tobias was buried. She was 61. Her lungs were sound. She had followed Tobias's rules for 27 years and never once breathed the deep chamber air. Her heart failed on a March morning when the bats were returning from their winter range, and the cave was beginning to warm again after the cool months. Minnie was there. She closed her mother's eyes and walked to the cave and opened the high shutter for a measured count, 10 minutes, the way Adeline had taught her, and then closed it. The front chamber warmed. The candle flame held steady. The cave breathed on. Within 10 years of the norther, at least 11 families in the valley used some version of Adeline's principles. Not all cave heat, not all sealed partitions, but the underlying logic of controlled air, stored warmth, and the discipline to close a vent before comfort became danger. Her exact cave remained unique because the conditions that produced it were not reproducible, and Adeline had spent the last decade of her life making sure everyone understood that. The warm room was not a recipe. It was a response to a specific place, a specific danger, and a specific woman's refusal to die in the manner the world had arranged for her. Adeline lived the rest of her life within sight of the limestone mouth that was meant to shame her. She kept Tobias's smoke-blackened vent tin over her kitchen door as a warning and a memory. She never entered the deep chamber. She never let anyone else enter it either. The last thing she said about the cave, recorded on Minnie's slate in a hand that had grown shaky but precise, was this: "The heat is still there. So is the poison. They were always the same thing." On the night of the norther, the same townspeople who had laughed at Rook's bat privy stood shoulder to shoulder under Adeline's timber wall, listening to sleet strike stone while warmth moved above them like an invisible current. Rook had said he gave her what her husband's debt was worth. The Norther answered differently. It answered with a thermometer reading of 59 degrees in a room behind a sealed wall, while the world outside froze solid, and with the faces of 13 people who were alive because a widow with a candle and a count of heartbeats had measured what the men who laughed at her had never thought to measure. Years later, Minnie opened the high shutter for a measured count as cedar smoke leaned, steadied, and rose. Behind the sealed wall, the dark cave breathed. In the clean room, children slept without seeing their breath. The town had mocked the cave because it stank of death, but Adeline Keeler had learned where the living heat was hiding,